All right, hello everyone. Welcome to this week's edition of A Sip of Knowledge with Marty Duffy, Liz Rhoades, and Lou Bryson, plus special guest Dr. Nick Morgan this week. I'll let your host give a more formal introduction to Dr. Morgan in just a moment. Real quick before I turn things over, I'm Will Hookinga from Zavvy.co. Just want to let you know, as always, a few different ways you can interact with your hosts and their guests throughout the show. So to your right, you'll see a chat box. I already see a number of people saying hello, letting us know where you're tuning in from, which is always great. See people from all over, Berlin, the UK, California, Hawaii. So always cool to see a global audience. If you have any specific questions for Dr. Morgan or for your host throughout the presentation, there's a little button at the bottom that says Ask a Question. Just hit that button, type your question in there. I'll be keeping an eye out for those. And last but not least, feel free to invite your friends to join us. There's a share button at the top of the screen that makes that easy. But with all that, I will turn it over to your host now. Marty, Liz, Lou, take it away.
Thank you, Will. You're like the third cousin I never had. So I would like to just introduce myself. I'm Martin Duffy, former senior master of whiskey for Diageo. Nick, you probably wrote about this in your book, for 14 years. And then 18 glorious months as the national brand ambassador for Benedictine. And 8 years as the co-producer of Chicago Independent Spirit Expo. And for the last 6.5 years, I have been the sole brand representative for Glencairn Crystal. So there you go. Oh, and by the way, in honor of our guest's book, today I am drinking a little craft brand, a little startup, really. Okay. All right.
Probably most people haven't even heard about that little brand.
We'll talk about it. We'll talk about it. Get people.
We'll educate. Yes, correct. I'll take over. Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining. It seems like we have a pretty geographically diverse crowd. So awesome. Thanks for joining. I'm Liz Rhoades, technical distiller and spirit consultant. I have just over a decade of experience in the alcoholic beverage sector, ranging across a few different products and substrates, including beer, rum, vodka, but my particular specialty and expertise is in whiskey. I spent most of my career at Diageo, so there's some themes in the show today. Diageo alum, but I am now currently founder and principal at Spirit Safe Consulting. And if you want to learn more about that, if you go to the About the Host section, there's a little link to my website, so check it out. Lou?
Thank you, Liz. I'm Lou Bryson. I'm a whiskey writer. I have never worked for Diageo.
Yeah, kind of.
I was a whiskey advocate for 20 years, and I'm currently a senior drinks writer for the Daily Beast website. And my latest book, Whiskey Masterclass, is the one I'm pushing. Yeah, look at that. Very nice. And today I am also Johnny walking with a glass of platinum.
Nice. I love platinum. Good choice.
Just grabbed it, you know.
I like that, Johnny Walker. That's nice. And so our guest today doesn't feel a little out of place. He is among a number of writers. Liz, of course, writes articles on distilling whiskey. Lou, been writing about whiskey for over 20 years, 25 years, with a couple of different books out. I, of course, wrote The Evil Friendship, which you can find at most adult bookstores. And it shares a lot in common with this little tome in that it's very salacious, a lot of So today's guest is yes, look at that.
Alvana.
And I guess I'll
just hold it.
Yeah. So
my copy's on Kindle and they all look the same, so
today's guest is a man I've known for a number of years, and Lou has too. And he's a historian, a musician. This is all off the top of my head. For the longest time, he was the man behind the classic malts of Scotland. which I love to get into a lot of the stuff behind the classic malts. And now, he's always been an author, but now he is an author of a book that I wish he had written 20 years ago when I could have used
your job easier, right? Yeah.
It would have been a lot easier. But thank God he's put it out, and it's really cool. It's great for any whiskey geek. Dr. Nick Morgan, everybody.
Hi. What an introduction, Matthew. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Now, Nick, your journey is interesting. I mean, it's funny. We've talked to a number of folks in the whiskey industry, and their journey into the industry is never what you would think it was. It didn't start in spirits. It started somewhere completely different. And yours is more in academia. I mean, you were got a degree in as a history major. How did you go from history to working for the classic malts? Were you in the liquor industry at all between that time?
Do you want the long version of the story, Marty, or the?
Yeah, we only have an hour. I only have an hour.
Okay, I'll give it the short version. I mean, I'd studied history at University in Lancaster, and then went on to write a PhD about the Society of Friends, Quakers, which is still available from all good secondhand bookshops, I think. So and maybe new as well. So I'd done my PhD, and the thing is, if you want to be a historian, you have to look around and try and get whatever jobs you can. So I first of all got a job working at University College London on a project to do with 19th century housing, which didn't have a lot to do with 18th century Quakers, but so be it. I spent a lot of time working in Scotland on that project. And then another piece of work came up, which was to be involved in a project called the Scottish Dictionary of Business Biography, Exhibit B.
Available on Kindle, right?
Yeah, that one. I think that one is out of print, and that was a really big project.
It looks like it's a little heavy to carry around.
2 volumes, Lou. 2 volumes.
Oh God.
So that was a really big project to research the lives and careers of Scottish businessmen from about 18 something or other through to 1960. And I was on it as a research assistant, an editor, and a writer.
Oh.
Well, I did that for about 3.5 years, based in Glasgow. And from that, I seamlessly managed to get myself a job teaching Scottish history in the University of Glasgow in the Scottish history department there. So I went from 18th century Quakers to modern Scottish history, and was working at Glasgow and quite enjoying myself. I was actually doing a lot of urban history research, and I had a contribution in this book, which is a really brilliant book about 19th century Glasgow. I was doing loads of other.
I'm sorry. What's modern Scottish history considered? What period?
Yeah, it's a good question, Lou. Actually, modern would be from 1707, really. But my period was really from about 1800 through to Second World War, just after the Second World War.
Okay.
So I was working at the University of Glasgow as a lecturer, which was quite a thing to get a proper lectureship. And in those days, those were jobs for life. Unlike now, you had what they call academic tenure. So you could not be, well, maybe if you committed some heinous offence, you could be fired. But for the most part, you were in with the bricks, with a good pension at the end of it. So I was there, and I got a sabbatical actually to finish off a piece of work that eventually appeared in that book I just showed you. And I came back. So my sabbatical, that's right, my sabbatical was a summer vacation, which didn't feel much like a sabbatical. And then the winter term. So I came back in the spring of, it would be 1990. And I had, what younger people would probably find this difficult to comprehend, but I had a pile of correspondence on my desk, letters, right? Letters and stuff, which I started wading through, already feeling a bit depressed that I was back at my desk and going to start teaching and whatnot. And in amongst this pile of letters was an invitation for me to go and speak to a company called United Distillers in London about a job as archivist. Okay. United Distillers, for those that don't know, had been set up just a couple of years before, following the merger, as I was taught to call it, the merger between the Distillers Company and Guinness PLC. And the Distillers Company, of course, had been the largest whiskey company in Scotland, well, in the world actually, but in Scotland it dominated the Scotch whisky industry. The takeover or merger with Guinness had been a pretty traumatic affair for a whole range of reasons, and a couple of quite smart people in this new company, United Distillers, one of whom was a long-standing DCL guy, great grandson of William H. Ross, very famous figure in the whiskey industry. The other was a guy who'd been brought in after the Guinness stuff. They decided that one of the things that was really missing in this new business was real sense of company culture, really sense of belonging, real sense of understanding about the brands, because a lot of new people had been brought in, a lot of old people had been fired quite brutally, to be frank. And they sort of asked around and realized that one of the things that was also missing was a lot of the stuff, the records, the archives, the physical material record of what had happened in the Distillers Company and the history of all its brands. And the Distillers Company had so many whiskey brands, in addition to Tanqueray Gin and Gordon's Gin and never knows what else, you know. So they got this project together to get an archivist, and they had a board of sort of informal board of historical consultants, and they had recommended that I was one of the 3 people who they spoke to about the position. So I thought long and hard about it. I decided it was one of those opportunities that, you know, it doesn't come along every day, and I went down and spoke to them. I met the 2 other people who I knew very, very well. I met one of them on the way in and one of them on the way out, so that was a bit embarrassing. Excuse me. But that evening when I got back to Scotland from being interviewed in London, they phoned me up and offered me the job.
Oh,
Nice.
that night.
That night. So what are you going to do? You know.
Turn it down naturally. That's why would I go.
Mull over it.
I maybe thought about turning it down for a second, you know, but not for much longer than that.
So now it turned out right after that, right around that area, this is the early 90s, correct?
We're in 1990 here. We're in
1990. So about 2 years later, was it that you were in charge of hiring an archivist for all the American whiskeys at the old Stitzelweller distillery, and you hired a young strapping young buck, Michael Veach.
Yeah, it's true.
Oh, okay.
It's true.
Hey,
That would have been right after its closing, correct?
Well, when I started going across, actually, and I never much thought about this, and then I mentioned it to someone, and they almost got on their knees and sort of kissed my feet, because I said, well, yes, of course, Stitzelweller was still making whiskey when I went there, you know. Yes, Ed Cook showed me around and explained how bourbon was made to me, and, you know, and of course, you do so much in your career, you do forget about these things, but Stitzelweller was great. It was just a lovely little distillery. And, you know, obviously it's great that they've got the visitor center there now, and they've got the sort of experimental distillery at the back. Yeah. But boy, if they could have done what we're doing, or what Diageo, I should say now, is doing at Brora and Port Ellen, and properly brought Stitzelweller to life. Yeah. Not only would that have just been emotionally, I think, a real heart project, but boy, I think they would have made a lot of money out of that as well. A lot of serious money. Yeah.
When you think of some of the whiskey that's been coming out,
just or that 12 years ago.
Yeah. No, yeah. I went to visit Brora once, actually acclaimed leash, and then, oh, there's Brora. Hey, there's the old Brora. And you go in, and I saw the stills were still in there, but it kind of looked like it was being used as a tool shed or something. You couldn't tell. The windows were very dirty. And I said, why don't you guys start that up? What's the matter with you? My voice was really, really high at the time. So, how come you're not? And look, eventually the word went up the ladder, and you guys are doing it now. So, you're welcome. So, I mean,
Marty said.
So you hired Veach though during his, not to concentrate too much on Veach, but while the place was still open, they started up that archive.
We started the project then. So I was just asked to go over and have a look round, which was pretty interesting and illuminating in a whole number of ways, many of which I won't go into in this conversation, and sort of feasibility, and of course the feasibility seemed to be zero because there were no archives there. I mean, there's almost nothing. And then someone said, well, go up to New York because Shenley had a big record store that they set up when they thought that the Empire State Building was going to be bombed by the Germans or Japanese during the Second World War. And they moved stuff out to a place called New Rochelle, which some of you will know. You go through it on the train and things like that. So then the next trip I made, I went out there and got into this warehouse, and it was just astonishing. It was packed full of stuff.
Wow.
And there were two elderly people there who I think might have first gone when it moved from the Empire State Building during the Second World War. And it had they'd been totally forgotten about. Except they hadn't been totally forgotten about because there was a lawyer who was still alive who had worked for Lou Rosenstiel, the notorious head of Shenley. Yeah. And so after I'd spent my 3 days in New York, I went and met this gentleman I met him in Dallas. In fact, went down to Dallas. There was another reason for being in Dallas as well. And we had the most marvelous conversation. And I bought myself a little recorder so that I could put it on the desk and chat. The first thing he did, he just put his hand on it and said, "You are going to switch that off, aren't you?" So I spent an evening and a morning talking with Lou Rosenstiel's attorney, and I have no record of the conversation.
Which is how Lou would have wanted it, I'm sure.
Absolutely. That's hair-raising. So that material was moved down, Mike, to Stitzel-Weller in the end, and then it was moved back to some, I can't remember, it's been all over the place, and a lot of it's now in the University of Kentucky archive, I think, and some of it's being retained at Stitzel-Weller as well.
Some of it's in Mike's basement, I believe.
Well, I couldn't comment.
Actually, he took us on a tour, I think it was 2010, of the archives, and it hadn't been touched in a long time, I don't believe. But it hadn't officially been touched, but we went in there and he was pointing out that it had been picked upon by people unknown over the years.
Yeah, well, that was the same. That was the same with the material that we were dealing with, because when the DCL was taken over, stuff was taken home for safekeeping. People thought that it would be genuinely thought it would be just thrown away or trashed, so they sort of took it home. Some were genuinely stolen without fear of contradiction. Stuff was thrown away, taken out of skips by people and taken home. So when we set up the archive that Diageo now has at Menstrie, we went through a big search and rescue operation for about 3 years, and of course now it's a huge thing, looked after by a team of I think 6 professional archivists. So,
oh my gosh, wow!
Yeah, it's a big thing.
So, a question from a historian perspective, back to Scotland. So obviously, I feel like the Scotch whisky industry is a huge piece of Scotland's history in general. Were there a lot of overlaps from, your historian days or your history background that you wrote about or taught about that were intertwined with the Scotch whisky industry?
Oh yes, Liz, absolutely, and of course, particularly, all the stuff about Scotland being sort of industrial engine room of the British Empire in the 19th century, and the Johnny Walker story and the story of all those great blends of that period is part of that. And in fact, probably if I'd have had more time, I would have spent a lot more time thinking about that, because one of the things that sort of occurred to me quite early on, and I do mention it in the book, but I would have liked to have made a bit more of it, And it just occurred to me one morning, I can't remember where I was, but I was just thinking about it. Oh, it's really funny, whiskey, I know it's the British Empire, but Walker whiskey goes to Australia, then it goes to New Zealand, then it goes to South Africa. What's going on in these places? Well, of course, what was going on was gold and diamonds.
Okay.
And whiskey, which was a luxury product, exported Scotch whisky in the 19th century was a luxury product, or most of it was a luxury product, followed mineral wealth. And it did exactly the same thing in the 20th century, although it was oil that it was following for the most part, not gold and diamonds. So Venezuela, which just becomes a huge market out of nowhere, in the 1960s, and so on. So Scotch is part of a whole range of other stuff that's happening.
Of other histories geographically as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yes, absolutely. Well, one of the things is that I was interviewed a few years ago for a BBC TV documentary on Scotch, and I was interviewed walking around somewhere that I think Marty will have been to, which is the Barrel Park at Cambus Cooperage, which is the centralised cooperage that Diageo now has in Scotland. So funny enough, it's Scotch, right? So we have casks. We store our whiskey in casks, but the casks are stored in a barrel park. That's one of the great whiskey
irony,
of the world. So I'm walking around the Barrel Park with this famous Scottish actor who's sort of presenting the programme. And I'm doing sort of Scotch going around the world and all the rest of it in the 19th century. And I said, you just have to think of it as Scotland's gift to the world, right? And as I said it, I thought, that's a nice line. I'm going to keep that one.
Keep that one.
So I was astonished when I went to the premiere of the programme, which they held in a sort of nice bar in Glasgow. We're all invited up to see it. And there's the presenter, and the first thing he says is Scotch, Scotland's gift to the world. Bastards, what's going on there? And then Dave Broom used it in his film, Amber Light, as well. So it's one of my most stolen lines. But going back to the point.
That's how you know it's good.
That's right.
Scotch is Scotland's gift to the world, and as you give that to the world, so the world sort of takes over a bit. You're not in control of your own destiny, and even you have to think of what culture you belong in, because Scotch is so firmly established in the drinking culture of the United States, of Thailand or Taiwan, South Africa, and all these places. So the identity of the product sort of changes, and I think one of the issues that I've always identified with people who write about Scotch, particularly from the UK, is that they see it from such a UK-centric vision, where Scotch is held in a particular way, it's viewed in a particular way. But, the further you get away from the UK, the greater the difference is in terms of how Scotch is thought about and enjoyed, and becomes part of a sort of social culture.
Which brings us to something that you were involved with quite a bit, was the classic malts. And there's two things about that. One, how single malts really, though they've been over here in the US since the early 60s, and actually even prior, but really as a brands, early 60s. And then the classic malts come out in the late 80s, and the whole idea of regions, they really pushed the regionality of whiskey flavors. And then just the rise of single malts. Did you guys really think it was going to get to where it is today, where, people are spending tens of thousands of dollars on a bottle of single malt whiskey?
Yeah, I feel that I might personally have some responsibility, a little bit of responsibility for that, and it doesn't make me feel great, actually. It doesn't make me feel great. Not least because I got divorced about 10 or 15 years ago, and I had to sell all these bottles. And my goodness.
She got half?
No, but that's not the point. That's not the point. It's just like now they would be worth so much money. But anyway, so it's interesting. So the first thing I definitely want to put on record is that I was not responsible for creating the classic malt.
No.
That was done after the DCL had merged with Guinness and the United Distillers company had been formed. And that company was formed, and the whole merger deal was done on the promise of delivering something different back to investors and the city in London, So one of the first manifestations of that was Johnny Walker Blue Label. Here's something. We're going to create a non-aged expression of Johnny Walker and sell it for £99. That's a bloody ballsy thing to do in 1987. That's saying this is a different business. This is a different business model. And then the other thing they did was say, we're going to do something with single malt whiskey. Now, the DCL, and I write about this a bit in the book, although not as much as I would have liked to, the DCL, until the very last days, refused to do anything with single malts. And it's not that they didn't know that single malts were happening, but at the very high level of the company, they were just so fixated on being a blended Scotch company that they wouldn't let anything come in the way of that, and they wouldn't let anything threaten it. So although they had sales, they had this fantastic intelligence network of salespeople all around the world who filed regular reports of visits to markets, which are all in, or most of them are in the archive from the 1950s. It's astonishing data source about not just their brands, but other brands and other categories. I mean, remarkable amount of information. And from the 60s, they're coming back and saying, well, single malts in France and Italy, this sort of thing's happening. The Johnny Walker business actually tried to get Cardew going in the 60s and were blocked for budget and were told they couldn't do it. There was really some quite fruity language between people on that subject. And it was only just before 1987 that the DCL eventually released, in a single case, 6 different single malt whiskies. And it was called the Ascot Malt Cellar. And if I can remember rightly, it was Lagavulin, it was Talisker, it was Rosebank, it was Linkwood, it was Strathconnan, which was a vatted malt produced by James Buchanan. And I think there was a Hague vatted malt in there as well. I can't remember what it was called. So here was an idea of what have we got as a company? Well, we've got lots of single malts. So we can put them, unlike other people, in a case. A pub can buy a case and suddenly they can be a single malt expert because they got 6 different ones, Nice idea. So when United Distillers was formed, that idea was really exploded, And that was done by a guy called Mike Collings, who'd come in from the wine business. And Mike had all the wine language and the idea of regionality. And was taken learnings from the way that wines had spoken to consumers about taste over the previous 10 or 15 years, which had transformed the wine business in the UK and markets like that. And then he was had helping him a guy called Roy McMillan, and Roy had a Scotch background. So between the two of them, they dreamt up the whole thing and the whole idea and put these great brands out. And I made this odd transition from working in the archive to being a sort of marketing person in about 1994. It was about 1994, 1995. And I began working on Mike on some of his projects. And I got involved with the Rare Malt series that you may remember, some of you, which were...
the blue, yeah.
Yeah, the blue ones, which were bottling from a mixture of closed distillers, which we sold for £37 a bottle. I mean, it just we did one which was a Brora, the famous Brora 72 rare malt bottling, which I think now is worth £10,000 a bottle, and we sold it for £37. Absolutely nuts. And then I got involved in launching the Distillers Edition with Mike and working on that and the development of those sherry treated, finished versions of the classic malts. And then when Diageo was formed, which was in 1997, I somehow became global marketing director of single malt whiskies. And, and then had a wonderful 12, 15 years working on those brands. My goodness, that was such fun. And that was when, Marty, you and I got to know each other really well.
So, Nick, do you notice in the background, it's a classic malt cruise flag?
I can't see it, Marty.
Oh, I see it. I see the emblem. Oh, boy.
Yeah. I forget which Toppy.
Look at that.
Toppy was our cook,
Monster.
and she sent this to me.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, love this. I was a couple of near-death experiences on that trip, but well worth it. That's how I'd want to go. Actually.
It wasn't that bad, Marty. Although I do remember we all got very, very wet one afternoon.
It was great. Well, that had to be a lot of fun because you did those all the time. It felt like you did.
Well, I did those for I can't remember 10 or 12 years, and actually it killed me in the end.
Wow.
And when other people said, "Look, I think we've done this long enough," I was the first person to go, "You know what? You're absolutely right. You know, you can't keep on killing me for 2 weeks, and every summer it takes me a month to recover." And because we had these charter boats, and we would take journalists on them, but the whole event lasted for a fortnight, but our charter boats ran in cycles, 3 cycles. So we turned over, hot-bedded them. So when we were busy, we had about 50 journalists coming through. And you're entertaining them each time. You're at sea. It's pretty hard. It was one of the best events for getting writers, and I suppose we'd now call them influencers. It wasn't a word that we used at the time. Getting writers and influencers close to your brands, because you had to live and breathe it on those boats. There was no way, you weren't going home. You got on the boat at Oban, you were going to Talisker.
Now,
yeah.
You got on the boat at Talisker, you were going back down to Oban. You got back on boat at Oban, second time round, you were going to Lagavulin, and then somehow we'd get you onto a bus or a car that would get you back to an airport to take you home.
Yeah, Marcy Rudershaus and the master of whiskey in Florida and myself both became violently ill our first day. Yeah, and literally on the boat, and
off the boat.
And luckily, I was able to snap out of it within the day. But poor Marcy, she was basically in her cabin for the whole week because can't get off the boat. It was like an apocalypse now. Don't get off the boat. It's all the way.
These are 35, 40-foot yachts. I mean, they were nice boats, and the skippers on them were great. Everyone was expected to help sail the boat, as it goes. But I remember we had some people who turned up, and they'd been told they were going on a cruise in Scotland, and they had sort of trunks, evening dress, and all that. And they spent the first day sort of looking a bit strange, and then for the most part, the rest of it, they just gave up and enjoyed it. What else could you do?
They thought there was like the Howls on Gilligan's Island.
Right. See, I know that reference, Marty.
Very good. Nick, every once in a while, if anything happened before 2010, you got to kind of fill it in for Liz. A millennial.
So I had a question around the classic malts from a marketing perspective. I recall, so my time at Diageo, with the classic malts, I feel like packaging was a big driver, very, ornate decanters. Can you talk a little bit about when that started, or if it's, packed versus liquid, and what sort of drove the conversation over the years?
Well, with the classic malts, Liz, we didn't do decanters. I mean, they were pretty standard bottles, to be frank. I think the Dalwhinnie one was slightly different, and Glenkinchie, but otherwise it's sort of what we call standard whiskey bottles. But Mike Collins, who was a real packaging genius, I think, actually made the very sensible decision that if you were going to have a range of 6 whiskies, the one thing you would do was have 6 different design agencies. So rather than have all the packs designed by one agency, which would have meant inevitably that they would have sort of looked a bit similar, if not worse than, he ended up with 6 really different and highly differentiated packs. And actually, I do think that, the classic malts are really important in a number of respects. One is that they blew the category wide open. So it wasn't just they were successful. Arguably they could have been a lot more successful had we had more juice, but sadly we didn't. Different story. But they did it, I think, just in terms of opening up this idea of exploration and expertise. And we had a brilliant relationship marketing program called Friend of the Classic Malts, and there was a great program that was run out of New York by Michael Stoner, who you may remember, Marty, which was brilliant. So it was about packaging, but actually it was about education.
Okay.
Sitting underneath the classic malts was this idea of education, and it was something that, you know, there were always debates about internally, because it's like, why are we talking to people like this? Because they're just going to go and buy other people's malts. You know, this is what we used to call, or people call it, category growing activity rather than simply brand growing activity.
Right.
But we always made the case that the category had to grow, and the way the category had to grow was through education. And I think you told me that there was a guy called John Allen on this broadcast, maybe, if he's still there. Well, John, for many years, was editor of the Quake magazine and was one of the principal creatives involved in putting together brilliant material that we would send out all over the world to consumers. I mean, and it was in the old days of mail shots rather than everything being online, and, you know, quality was everything in terms of what we did. And of course, we carried that education through into sort of turning Royal Lochnagar Distillery into our school, if you want, or college for malt whiskey. So that was where we took our own internal people, and we took journalists, we took writers, we took customers and their people, to teach them about how whiskey was made, to teach them about sensory understanding, you know, and to teach them about our brands as well. But at the end of the day, they could have gone out and used that information for anything. You know, and I like to think that we made a huge contribution, not just to the success of our own products, but actually really helped grow the category in that respect.
You know, Nick, I always thought that, Lou, did you ever go on the Malt Advocate course? That course was amazing. It was really intensive. It was a week long, and you'd have people like Nick and Jim Beveridge. They would have Dave Broom there, which was interesting. I know you and Dave are old friends, but it was an interesting. Dave was your devil's advocate.
We always had either Dave or Charlie McLean as an independent voice. So, which
was great.
Yeah.
You loved hearing it, especially if they would call whoever just said something and they go, wait a minute. That's a little hinky, which was great. I mean, that's what we were looking for as brand ambassadors, because we kept on being fed all the PR stuff. We wanted the real story, so we'd have a foundation of information. We weren't going to spout it, but.
And, you know, it was quite interesting, Marty, because when we started, you say the real information. So I wanted the real information as well. and Lord, you might be surprised, and Liz, I think you would be surprised, given there's so much more transparency now in businesses internally, as well as the way they talk to consumers. But at the time, there was a sort of big concrete wall. You know, why do you want to know that? And I remember we went up for a meeting in the end, because we kept on asking. You know, we were a nuisance, so we went up for a meeting in the end with someone listening. You may have come across or heard of. Maureen Robinson was there, and a gentleman who's one of our long-standing blenders and worked very closely on malts. Very, very good colleague and good friend. And also a gentleman who's now retired called Neil Cochrane, who was a sort of distilling expert. I mean, what Neil didn't know about distilling wasn't worth knowing. And so we sat there and they said, well, you've been asking about this stuff. So Neil said, I'm going to talk to you a bit about how we make whiskey. And Maureen's going to talk to you a bit about maturation and all this. And it was just like eyes open on sticks. You know, it's like, no one told me any of this before. You mean we've got these worm tubs because they make this sort of whiskey, and then and we've got all these worm tubs and no one else has, and we haven't spoken to them about them? Yeah. You know, what on earth's been going on? So that was one of those meetings. I have had a few of those meetings. My first meeting with Jim Beveridge, which was on the pier at Lagavulin, is another one that absolutely sticks in my mind. But this one in Edinburgh was just fabulous. And after that, we said, right, we're going to tell people this. We're going to tell as many people. We're broadcasting this stuff, you know, because it's like gold. This is what I think. There are people out there who'd be quite interested to know. Yeah.
So I yeah, to your point, from my experience, I felt like there were a lot of questions being asked, and I did interact a lot with, the demand side of the business. So I guess I have maybe you to think about that.
Possibly or not, depending on how.
But to your point, it was good, I think, to have that dialogue, to get that information out.
Well, everything was secret, and I think that in United Distillers and as it became Diageo, I think a lot of that was a hangover from the Distillers Company, where they just didn't want to talk to anyone about anything, So the idea that, like a Lagavulin, that's like
Nick?
That to me and give me a number that I can use for the PT. We can't tell you that. It's too confidential. Yeah. We can't possibly tell you that,
Well, what was the? I remember. I also think there was a lot of the marketers just didn't think that would be interesting, or it didn't fit within their story. I remember going and finding Johnny Walker's grave in Kilmarnock and noticing, wait a minute, he had another son. Yeah, oh my God, how come he had another son? We never talk about his other son, which was, I believe, John Walker. And so I remember going to Cardew not too long right after that, saw Ian Williams, who was the brand home manager, and I asked him, how come we never talk about that? And he goes, who's that? I go, Ian, you don't even know. They didn't even tell you. You go, get that tombstone, bring it over. I'll go load up in the car, bring it in, and we'll check these people out. I just found, I just figured marketing, that's how I always felt over on this side, is that marketers just didn't care.
I tell you, I think, no, it's not they don't care, Marty. I wouldn't say that, because most of the people I met who are responsible for marketing in Scotch Whisky, both in Diageo and other companies, are really smart people. They're really smart people. But they are marketeers, and I think when I came into, I was not a marketeer. I was a phony. Historian, archivist, global malt whiskey marketing director. How did that happen? And I was a bit of an enthusiast, and I recognized that there were other people out there who were enthusiasts and who just didn't want to be spoken to in a marketing sort of way. They wanted to be spoken to like adults, if you will, and trusted with information. And that's what we tried to do. And I think increasingly the industry is like that now in terms of both single malts and blends as well.
Yeah, but now they want even more. They just never stop.
Now they want even more. Yeah. Well, it's a Pandora's box, isn't it, Lou? If you open it up,
They want to break down the atoms inside the nucleus of a kernel.
What size is your wrist?
Yeah. It's like, why? Can you taste it? Can you taste it?
That's what I always want to ask. I'm like, what are you going to do with that information exactly?
Yeah, these were the questions that got trickled down to me.
Well, you're a scientist, Liz. They're going to get you with those. Real quick. So one last question about the classic malts before we move on to your book. In recent years, they seem to have broken up the classic malts. It's no longer really the classic malts. In fact, I'm not even sure if they use the term that much, at least over here. And it's really, they focus in on Talisker, Oban, and Lagavulin, which is kind of sad. I thought, all those the other whiskeys might not have been selling as much, but they all had their fans. So why break it up after all that time?
I think that was just driven by commercial imperatives, Marty. It's a case of going where the sales are, and I think increasingly it was so the big relationship marketing program we had. It was like, well, really, if we figure out how much of this is going on Glenkinchie, and yet we don't sell that much Glenkinchie, and we could use some of that money to promote Talisker instead, and we got Talisker really motoring as a brand, and it sort of became a breakout brand. So I think it was just a case of recognizing some commercial realities, and also it's a bit, it's nice. It was a nice thing to have when it started, but it becomes a bit of a millstone around your neck in the end, if you want to grow individual brands. And we had rare malts, and we launched Kalila and Klein Leash, and we had Raw Nagar, and then we started doing the special releases, which is when all the pricing went absolutely nuts. So it just became all a bit too complicated, I think. And we would have these regular meetings where people would go, what are the classic malts? And 3 hours later, you come out of the room with all these flip charts full of nonsense. And,
I still have a lot of those flip charts. I have tons of those. I say
behind you.
I have yes, there too. I got all my old all the stuff I was given from the classic malts. Vast archives over here, Nick, if you ever need it.
The Marty Duffy archive.
The Duffy archives.
We used to leave flip charts behind in meeting rooms, not always just Diageo meeting rooms, with deliberately misleading and very mischievous things written on them.
Oh, wow.
Just to heavily confuse whoever came next. And we used to do that particularly in the old Scotch Whisky Association offices in Court Street in London, where we would have meetings, and we just write some absolute provocative nonsense on it and just leave it behind and see if the bell rang,
Hopefully, someone from Doers or Famous Grouse comes in and takes
the floating distillery was the best one.
There was one story, with the Masters of Whiskey. We were at the Whiskeys of the World in San Francisco one year, and one of them, I will not name who it was, came up with the bright idea of crop dusting the Doers table all the time. He was very gassy, and so
oh my God,
that's the kind of marketing animosity there was over here. I don't think you're aware of it, Nick. You're sheltered from all the ugliness.
So let's get on to the book.
Right, but here, real
Yes.
quick though, just so you know who's out there, from Aaron, there's Gunnar Nielsen and Tyler from Kohana, Carolyn Dewar, and Kathleen from SoCal, from Southern California, Eve Cosentino.
Eve Cosentino, hello.
Yeah, our man Eve. Used to manage Bushmills for Diageo. Let's see, Frank Patino, and a bunch of other folks. Christina Wolf, she's every week. Thank you, Christina. She's always here.
And she also said alcohol was, is, and will continue to be an important part of history and politics.
Boom. And Alan says Glen Levin malt.
Glenleven, that's the Hague blended malt. Well remembered.
Oh.
He is adding it. Tina Wilford, and I think that's it. So let's talk about this book. Like I said, this is a book. Holy cow. If it came out 20 years ago, this is all the information. Nick, I don't know if you remember when the Masters of Whiskey came over for that Malt Advocate course. We had stayed up all night on the plane, and we were really, really tired because we were so excited. And then we land, and then you guys wouldn't let us go to sleep. We're going to rest up. So you took us to Balmoral Castle, and then afterwards we had a big steak dinner at Royal Lochnagar. And then you brought us into the main lounge with a roaring fire and big leather.
A warm, dark room.
Yeah. With whiskey, and you're going to finally tell us the whole story of Johnny Walker and everything, stuff that all of us have been talking about. We're going to find out the real story. We're going to find out everything, all the nuts and bolts. And then I don't know about everyone else, but I felt right asleep and never heard it. I asked you later in the week, could you please redo it? You said, no, Monty, no. And it sounded like you were a little mad. And I might not have been the only one who fell asleep and you took it personally, but we were exhausted.
Well, Mike Nicholson, who was looking after Royal Lochnagar at the time and sort of hosted the courses for us, when I did that talk on a Monday night, he would disappear behind one of the sofas, lie on the floor, and which I didn't take offense to, I have to say. So.
That was going to be the perfect fireside chat, and unfortunately, I slept through it. But now we got this.
Now you can read the book.
Yeah, hold up your Kindle. So tell us about the book. And I mean, it's from what you were telling us earlier, it was kind of 20 years in the making.
Yeah, I mean, it's a project. You know, when I first was involved in setting up the archive, a lot of the Johnny Walker material that had been in London had been sent up to the bottling plant at Kilmarnock at Hill Street for genuine safekeeping. I mean, that was one of the bits of work that was done really well. And in fact, Dewar did the same thing. They got stuff out of Dewar House and sent it up to Perth. So there was all this material there, which was being looked after by a gentleman called Gilmore Burnett, who was the last line of Johnny Walker blenders to work sort of at Kilmarnock. And I just saw this stuff and I thought, well, there's a book here. You know, there's a book here. Now we moved it all over to the archive that we set up, and of course you go and look at things now and again to help answer queries, because that was what the archive was there for, but never really had the time to get into it and think about it properly. And it was just an idea that I kept in my head. And we had this thing, or in Diageo, when I was in Diageo, I had this thing called, you know, an annual review process in which you were supposed to put down what your ambitions were, you know, where you wanted to be in the business. And from about, I would say, the year...
I really do have it.
Nice. Yeah, we can see the...
Yeah, from the year to 2000 or just shortly after that, I would just put down every year, write the history of Johnny Walker to be published in their bicentenary in 2020. So I made it very clear to people that was what I wanted to do. So I mean, it's a book that's been almost 30 years in the thinking.
Wow.
But actually 3 years in the researching and writing, just over 3 years. And, you know, Diageo were very generous to give me the time to do that. And they didn't, because no one knew anyway. They just didn't know what I was doing, but they couldn't really ask me because they wouldn't have understood. So they just absolutely let me get on with it, which was huge.
Wow.
Is that all you did? You weren't...
I had a couple of other things that I had to look after, Marty, but I was totally divorced from the sort of marketing side of the business and focusing on.
That's like a dream, Nick.
Absolutely, no, absolutely.
Wow.
And I made clear to everyone at Diageo that was involved. I had a few sponsors, you know, who made it happen for me. Just how grateful I was for that, because it was a big thing to do. And I hope that Diageo is as pleased with the book as everyone else seems to be, because people have been very generous about it in terms of what they've said. You know?
I think this is amazing. I mean, this is a great book for anyone who's starting a distillery now or starting a brand, just to see how it evolved and the trials and tribulations. And also, you can create a long-lasting brand and not live very long yourself.
Yeah,
so that's reassuring.
There's a couple of things, Marty, I'd say about it. The first thing was that I made it clear that I wanted this to be a book about Scotch whisky and Johnny Walker, and not just about Johnny Walker. So it's not. Yeah. Hang on a minute, I'll just show you something. So this is the Bell Scotch Whisky History, the Pride of Perth. That was written by a gentleman called Jack House, who's a famous journalist in Glasgow in the 70s and 80s. And in the 90s, I met him a few times when I was in Glasgow. But that's a real old-fashioned company history. You know, it's all just about the business, about how great everyone was, photographs of the executives in the boardroom with clocks and playing golf and all of that stuff. And I made it very clear that was not what this book was going to be about. It's going to be a proper history, and it was going to be about Johnny Walker and the growth of Scotch whisky category. And I think it's delivered that. So as far as I'm concerned, it's not just a book that you would read if you're interested in Johnny Walker. If you're interested in Scotch whisky, or actually if you're interested in whisky, then there's going to be stuff in here that you will benefit from reading. And that's very much my view of it.
Hey, Nick, was I imagining it when you said that there was a photograph once of somebody standing in front of a portrait of Johnny Walker, of the actual Johnny Walker?
This is somebody asked to see it just now.
What's the book look like?
That was for Tina.
It's so there's a painting of George Patterson Walker, who was the grandson of John Walker and was chairman of the company for about 25 years. And there's a painting of him, and behind him on the wall, like these pictures behind me on the wall, is what looks like a portrait of John Walker, which we don't have. There is a sort of, I'm not sure what you call it, that cross between a photograph and an etching that they did in the late 19th century of George at his desk, and behind him is a painting of his father, Alexander. So John, Alexander, George. And we've never seen that painting, although in his letter books, which I spent about 6 months reading, Alexander Walker writes rather grumpily about having to go and have this sit for this portrait, which I think to try and get him to sit down for 5 minutes would have just been impossible. And, yeah, he was very grumpy about it. But so the pictures we have of these people, the images are scant, and of course, typically, with the exception of the second Alexander Walker, who became Sir Alexander Walker, who we have some photographs of as a very young man, the only images we have of these people is as old men. And of course, that really sets off the wrong sentiment about them, because these people were not old men. They were young men in a hurry. They were young men in a hurry. And John started his business after his father died. He was a miner when that grocery business, not miner in the coal mine, but underage, when that grocery business started in Kilmarnock. And when he died and his son Alexander took over the business, Alexander, I think, was only 18 or 19 or something like that. So, I mean, these were young men, and what they achieved was as young men. And it always seems a shame that you only see them as like there are three on this call, Liz. I apologize for these grey beards that you've got to put up with,
I'm used to it.
Yeah,
Liz has a grey beard too. Don't.
But you can use words, Marty, to try and give you a portrait of these people. And people like John's a bit difficult. We really don't know much about him, but his son Alexander, Alexander's sons John or Jack, George, and also Alexander, and all the other sons that we didn't actually know about when we started researching this book. So the family's got considerably bigger now than it was, as it were, 3 years ago. But some of those really come to life through their actions, and what they did in their careers. So you do get a sense of the Walkers, and boy, they were very different from the Dewars and the Buchanans. We think of these people they call whiskey barons, celebrities, publicity seeking. I mean, Tommy Dewar was a narcissistic publicity seeker, and that was what his business was about. That was how he drove his business. It was like a Richard Branson character, entrepreneur character today. But the Walkers would have none of that. They were doer, and they were, to use a Scottish word, they were thrawn. And Alexander Walker, I mean, you would not want to, although he had a very warm side, you would not want to cross these people. They didn't take, wouldn't suffer idiots at all. And they were determined and gritty and resilient, and that's one of the reasons that the business was so successful. They didn't understand the idea of failure, and they didn't understand the idea of not being able to do something.
Yeah,
George, it's a Victorian thing as well. What do you mean no one's bottled 50,000 cases of whiskey before? There must be a way of doing that. We'll find someone who knows how to do it. Can do. Astonishing, really, absolutely astonishing.
So what separated their brand from the Dewars, who were very big over here in the U.S. or making big inroads here in the U.S. and also by them sending Jack down to Australia? Is that how? I mean, Southeast Asia is Johnny Walker land.
Yeah, but not then. So although they were in some Asian markets. I mean, they were in Singapore and Penang and places like that in the 1880s. But these first markets were very much, and it's a word that people use with some distaste now, but they were colonial markets. They were part of the British Empire, and that was where business was done. If you were down in Australia and New Zealand, well, there were quite a few places in between that you could get to as well. So that's how you got into Singapore. Well, there was a big British influence there, of course. as well. And it's interesting. I'd just say this, Marty. I know we were talking about it before we started, but Scotch whisky very much follows mineral wealth as it grows around the British Empire. So it's gold and diamonds. So in the 1890s, it's all about South Africa. I mean, South Africa just becomes a huge market almost overnight as they find diamonds and gold there. And that quite interests me because in the 20th century, Scotch whisky follows a different mineral wealth, which is oil. But it's the same sort of process that's going on. So you've got liquid gold following real gold, you know?
Yeah, Brad Krause says Latin America too.
Yeah.
He's
Latin
watching.
That's the whole thing we were talking about that earlier, the Venezuela.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Well, and it was in the early '80s when you had the big drop in the Scotch whiskey market. A lot of it, I had been told, was due to economic downturns in Brazil and a number of areas in South America, as opposed to.
Well, I mean, you know, the whiskey market, as you can see, if you look at the Walker Business, and there are 4 or 5 graphs in that book, which bloody hell, I sweated getting the data for those, I can tell you. But in a sense, if you've got a short span of attention, just look at the graphs carefully, and they'll tell you the whole story. But the graphs inevitably are going up, but then they stop, and then they go up again, and they stop. I mean, this is a brand that's gone through war in South Africa. That was a bad thing to happen, you know, in the 1890s. That was not good, just the state of that market. It suffers from fiscal vicissitudes, and particularly in the early 20th century, the famous budget in the UK in 1909, Lloyd George's budget, which rapidly increases the price of Scotch. You've got the First World War. You have, in case you've forgotten, an influenza pandemic around the world. That was when Johnny Walker had their centenary. So there's something odd here. A centenary, influenza pandemic, bicentenary pandemic. So I'm glad I'm not going to be here for the next one because I can't imagine what that would be like. Then you've got something called Prohibition, which we could talk about. Then you have the Great Depression. Then you have the Second World War. You know, I mean, these are tough times for businesses to come through. And the fact of the matter is that every time you have one of those, the business takes a dunt, you know, a step backwards, but then it comes back stronger. And if you look at the graphs, you'll see how phenomenally stronger it comes back each time, you know.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I mean, I've been told by a number of folks originally from India or of Indian descent, they talk about, to this day, a house is not a home without a bottle of Johnny Walker Black Label. I mean, it's a funny holdover, you know, but it's sophistication, it's class, it's hospitality, and I guess.
I remember we used to get letters at Whiskey Advocate. I can't remember. I mean, there wasn't one every issue, but there was almost at least once a year, we'd get a letter from somebody who said they had essentially used a bottle of red as currency. You know, it was just, and it was a standard. It was like, I will get you here for that bottle. Done.
A number of famous British journalists, Lou, who are down on record as saying whenever they traveled, they had 2 bottles of Johnny Walker in their suitcase. One was to drink, one was to get them out of trouble, you know?
I've been a guy from Australia who was making his way back from Australia to New York, and then I guess he was moving on to London, and his territory at one point was Africa. I said, really? You go down to Africa? I mean, at the time, this is, I don't know, about 15 years ago, I just thought of, there's a lot of war-torn revolutions and stuff going on. I mean, you travel through there? He goes, oh, yeah. Oh, mate, no problem. And I go, well, don't they ever attack you? He goes, no. They put a Johnny Walker flag on the Jeep. No one's gonna kill you, Johnny Walker guy. I
always thought, and maybe there's a novel in this that I have yet to write, but I always thought that whiskey salesmen would make the best spies, you know, the very best spies. because everyone thinks they're drunk all the time, which of course sometimes you have to accept a lot of hospitality. But these are smart people and they know what they're doing, and I talk about that in the book about in the 50s and 60s, 1950s and 60s. But there's just this thing. It's the whiskey salesman. Let the whiskey salesman in. What harm can he do?
Well, we did I presented George W.H. Bush a bottle for his work for Katrina, a bottle of the Cask Strength Blue Label. And I think someone else was doing it for Clinton in another place. But I'm walking in. I'm dressed in they wanted me in my kilt. And I had a skin dew. I had a derrick sticking on my side. I walk down this aisle full of Secret Service agents. I'm going right into a small room with the former president of the United States. And I don't know. They must have lasers on me. That's what I'm thinking. Lasers.
Someone told me a very funny story just a few nights ago about doing the address to the haggis at a Burn supper that was being held for the Crown. Is it the Crown Prince of Monaco? I think, and his wife and entourage. And there'd been some mix-up over the skein do, so he went to do the thing, and the skein do either wasn't there or I can't remember what it was. So he reached forward and picked up the knife from the serving in front of the Crown Prince's wife, and he said immediately, all the security guards, and the Crown Prince just put his hand up, so they're all there, just about to frozen. As this table knife goes into the haggis in place of the skein do.
Robbie Burns can be deadly sometimes.
Yeah.
Hey, go ahead, Lizard.
Oh no, I just went and grabbed my piece of Johnny Walker archive with my my poker dice here.
Oh wow. I actually have two little chests right here full of Johnny Walker stuff that I collected during my days as Johnny Walker. I used to love collecting all the old stuff. Now it's just sitting there collecting dust. So archives. Yeah.
I think they're always looking for donations, Marty. And
so am I. I'm looking for donations as well.
So I know we're running out of time, but I think we wanted to touch really quickly on your new book that you're beginning to research. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and what the next chapter, no pun intended, is going to look like?
Sure, Liz. Well, I'm actually in the middle of writing this book now against quite a tight deadline, and it's sort of intended to be a more general book about whiskey, principally about Scotch whiskey, but also talking about American, Canada, Irish, Japanese whiskey, and obviously all the new startups sort of all around the world will come into it. Its target audience, I suppose, is the novice, the interested novice. Okay. So it's written at quite a general level, but it's peppered with sort of pieces of information which might surprise people who believe they know a lot about whiskey. So there's sort of some good new stuff in there which for various reasons didn't get into the Johnny Walker book. And then it's also going to be just a little opinionated. I mean, for those of you that have seen me speak, you'll know that I have quite strong views on a number of subjects and been sometimes a little constrained from expressing those whilst I worked at Diageo. So I'm a bit less constrained in this next project. And you should look forward to the chapter on whiskey experts and whiskey snobs, because that's going to be a clear.
Okay, that'll be one to look out for.
That'd be excellent. Hey, Nick, I'd be amiss, and I think the boys in Scotland would be mad at me if I didn't ask about your mention of and I never heard of this before, the Glencairn whiskey.
Glencairn whiskey, yeah.
That they had? I mean, that's crazy. How come that was, I've never heard of it until your book.
So that was a blend that was created by Alexander Walker to go into Australia. At the time, we're talking about the mid-1880s. At the time, they were selling principally what they call their Old Highland whiskey brand in Australia, and Glencairn was meant to be a cheaper blend. Although, as Alexander Walker said, still a very distinctive character and taste. He was very particular to say that about it. And it got the name, Marty, from Glencairn Square, which is in Kilmarnock.
Yeah.
So a lot of the names they used for different brands that they had a look at were local Kilmarnock names. I mean, the Walkers were hugely proud of Kilmarnock, and it meant a lot to them. So,
and his house still exists outside of the farmhouse, I guess. Doesn't it still exist outside of Kilmarnock, Johnny Walker's birthplace?
So Johnny Walker's, well, yeah, Todrig's farm. There was a building there, and it's a very substantially built building. But my suspicion is it may have actually been built after John was born, and not be that. I mean, it would definitely be the site that he was born at, but not necessarily the place. The house that John lived in latterly was actually demolished when the Hill Street plant was built in the 1950s. So because it was up on that side of Kilmarnock. One of the first Alexander Walker houses in Kilmarnock is still there, and in fact, it's been made down into flats, apartments. One of which is a B&B, and I stayed there deliberately when I worked in Kilmarnock. So I thought, what better way to get close to the guy than live in? I think I was in the servants' quarters, but at least live in the house. And Alexander built a house in Troon, which is just near Kilmarnock, where there's a very, very famous golf course, and he was a passionate golfer. So he built a house there, and then his son, one of his sons, Sir Alexander Walker, also built a house in Kilmarnock, which is now a hotel called Pearsland House Hotel.
And didn't someone find a bunch of stuff in an attic, and it turned out it was Johnny Walker's, but they threw it out? You ever hear that story?
Well, I didn't, but it wouldn't surprise me. I mean, the interesting thing is, I had this huge archive to work with, but the thing that you realize when you start getting into an archive is that it's only a fragment of the material that was created. It's only a fragment. And goodness me, if we didn't have these letter books from Alexander Walker, which were not complete, so we mostly had his out letters, but we didn't have so many of the in letters. And we certainly didn't have all of his out letters, but there was enough there to really work with. If we hadn't had those, the book would have been impoverished, I think, compared to what we did have. James Stevenson, who we haven't mentioned, who was from Kilmarnock and joined the business in the late 19th century and became very, very important, and very important politically as well. He was a remarkable person. A small collection of his material in an archive in England, which I went to look at. And the first thing is a speech that he was giving to some people, and he talked about how he kept a diary every day of his working life. We have none of the diaries. It's like you just bang your head on the desk. It's like, what happened to these things?
George Patterson Walker was really pissing me off today.
So we had two questions, so maybe we'll catch those real quick. First, Liza is on, and she said, Dr. Nick, if you do write a novel, may suggest Undercover and Overproof as a title.
Very good, Liza.
So the first question we had actually before the show even started, so let's get that. And the question was around what's the best organic whiskey?
Oh, in this new book, seriously, the last chapter is called What's Your Favorite Whiskey? And that's because, as we will all know, whenever you go and talk to people, or you even meet someone and start talking on a plane or something like that, you always know it's going to happen eventually. What is your favorite whiskey?
What do you drink?
What
is your favorite?
So I've asked some friends around the world to answer that question for me. It's going to be quite a funny chapter, I hope. But short chapter, but short and funny. Best organic whiskey? Organic whiskey? Well, I'm not sure about organic whiskey, really. I mean, obviously, Bruichladdich famously make a lot of the whiskey they produce from organic barley and also from the barley that's grown on Islay. Not all of their organic barley comes from Islay, but I don't think that really matters. But whether you can taste organic in whiskey is a technical question, Liz, which I might put back to you, because I've discussed it with people and we've come up with a bit of a question mark?
Yeah, I would argue that it would be really hard to put a stamp on this is what you can expect out of a flavor profile with organic.
I don't know that I can taste organic in carrots.
Yeah.
Let alone in whiskey. So
I'm too busy filtering out glutens out of my spirits because leave that.
I think
gluten
that's
taste.
I think more of a marketing driven discussion.
I think so. I think that, but I would say, Lou, you feel organic carrots in your wallet. That's
yes, you do.
That's Whole Foods.
That's why people are very keen to drive organic as part of their marketing story, as Liz says.
Yeah.
Any other question?
Yeah. So our last question from Christina Wolf was, what can you tell us about the ancient distillers in Scotland and Ireland, or which channels, archives, museums, libraries do you recommend to contact?
Well, so I have to be honest and say I don't know that much. My whiskey history sort of starts in the 18th century and not much before. There are some interesting archaeological papers written, for example, about distilling in the Cabrach in Speyside, which is where Glenlivet is, and those are available online. Actually, if you sort of type around, there are lots of really good PDFs you can download. I know there's a young man at the moment doing some really interesting archaeological research on distilling and distilling sites and stuff like that. So I think my takeout is that we don't actually know that much at the moment, but we're going to know a lot more because a lot of serious historians and archaeologists have got interested in it, and they have the tools now to sort of do the research that they need to.
Yeah. Do you think that's a new thing that alcohol research in general is being taken more seriously?
Well, I think if I think about UK academics, there's been a lot of proper research. I mean, this here he is. Ron Weir sadly died a few years ago, but wrote the history of the Distillers Company.
I got that.
Absolutely brilliant book. It's a bit dry, but because Ron's an economic historian, but I mean, it's got so much in it. Ron had done a PhD on Scotch whisky in the 80s, I suppose, and I think there's been quite a lot of academic work, but it hasn't sort of filtered out into more popular currency, I suppose, is what you'd say. But certainly now it's pretty fashionable. Although I realised, looking at something someone asked me about a few weeks ago, I realised that what the world really needs is a good gin history, which it does not have at the moment. It really doesn't have.
There's a lot of different camps as far as gin. Origins and.
Well, it needs a good gin history, and that would also then be a history of distilling in London as well, which I think would be really, really interesting to have.
I always like this book as a reference. It's more the history of various distilleries, especially closed ones. This book, Udo. I always love this book as a great reference book. I mean, it really just gives you all the stats of the distilleries, but it's great. But also, Christine, you might want to check for Irish. Peter Mulryan and Fiona O'Connor. Yeah, both written books. Fiona specializes in single pot still, but Peter has written a couple of books about the history, including one he did for Bushmills, which was very informative and got rid of some of the marketing stuff that we had been fed.
And both of them are likely to respond if you contact them directly too.
That's right. In fact, they're doing more. Fionan's doing that whole. He's creating a Nashville. Yeah. 200-year-old Nashville.
So our very last, very quick question, Nick, do you know if the second tome of the history of the DCL company has been published after all?
No, it was never published. Ron had his notes and papers, and they're still, as far as I understand it, with his literary executor. But it hasn't been done, which is a shame. Although I did try and tease out some of the stuff about the DCL, certainly from the, as they called it, the potable side, so the alcohol beverage side, in the book. beyond the period that Ron covers. Although, of course, there is so much in that period about chemicals and the sort of various diversification programs that they did, which actually Sir Alexander Walker was very heavily involved in.
Well, everyone, we are run out of time. In fact, we've run overtime because
I think the most overtime.
Yeah.
This
Dr.
very good
Nick,
conversation.
you could go on for another 40 minutes or so.
No, I have to have my refried haggis, Marty, quite soon. So.
One haggis coming up.
There's a link to the book below. Check the little green box. Give it a little click. Check it out. Looking ahead to next week, actually, I'm doing a little technical takeover, and we're preparing for a little mini series because February is the month of love. So we're gonna get intimate into the whiskey making process. We're gonna kick that off next week, talking about one of my favorites, Saccharomyces cerevisiae. So we're gonna be talking about yeast and fermentation, and the guy to talk to about that is Dr. Pat Heist of
with an even longer beard than Marty and I.
Yes, bigger than our beards combined, all three beards.
Yes.
When I think of love and Valentine's Day, I think of yeast. So that's perfect. That's great.
Whole month of February. Sign up, check it out. Sexy ass topics. That's what February's about.
Well, thank you, everybody. Thanks very much. Be here next week. And Dr. Nick, thank you very much, man. We got to have you back.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Nick.
you so much.
Tip of an iceberg. That's all we got.
Thank you. It's been a really entertaining conversation. I'm very pleased you invited me. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nick.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Cheers.
Bye, everyone. Cheers.
Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.